There is nothing like a pandemic to make you realise how important our food sources are. That's why in this video I'm going to give you some powerful tips on how to grow fantastic potatoes so that you get really good results and can feed your family in times of crisis. I'm Tony O'Neill and this is Simplified Gardening, where I show you how to garden in a simpler way. If you want that perfect garden to relax in or just want to grow your own nutrient-dense foods, then start now by clicking the subscribe button and the bell icon, then click all to be notified each time I release new content just like this. Potatoes are one of the most versatile crops to grow, and if you've followed my channel for any length of time, you will know I love growing potatoes. That's why in this video I'm going to give you some of the most powerful tips I possess to get you started in the right track. Believe me, you're not going to want to miss anything in this video, so I suggest you stick with it right to the end. But to make things easier, in the show notes below I will put a detailed description of timestamps where you can jump through to different areas of this video, and also to videos that I may suggest throughout this video, so that it makes it easier for you to come back and continue to use this resource in the future times. Like all good stories, that starts at the beginning, and the beginning of potatoes is choosing your varieties. Now, depending where you are in the world will depend on the varieties that are available to you and what you would call them. Now, in the States and other parts out there, you will be calling them Determinate and Indeterminate, whereas in Europe they tend to call them First Early, Second Early and Maincrop. So before we continue, let's have a look at what this actually means. Indeterminate potatoes are potatoes that are really fast growing. They grow on a single layer and they are much smaller in size. They are typically things like salad potatoes or new potatoes, and they are great because they can be started early in the year. First and second earlies are those potatoes that are like salad potatoes, such as Nicola and Charlotte, and they are fast growing and they don't store very well. And the first and second earlies are akin to the USA's Indeterminate potatoes. In the USA, the vernacular Determinate and Indeterminate is used. Now, Determinate potatoes, they grow on multiple levels up the stem. They typically get much bigger and they have a longer growing season, and they are fantastic for long-term storage. Maincrop are the same as Determinate potatoes. They typically get larger in size, they're a more versatile crop, and they also are able to store right through winter. I hope that this clears up the confusion between Indeterminate, Determinate, First Early, Second Early and Maincrop potatoes, depending on where you are in the world. This will allow you to understand when someone mentions those terms. I have a more dedicated video on potato varieties called Potato Varieties 101, and I will put a link in the show notes below. So now we've decided what potato varieties we're going to use. Now what? Well, the next thing we need to do is take our potatoes and we need to chit them. Now, all chitting means is to create sprouts on the potato. It's called chitting, and it's basically to shoot or to sprout the potato. Now, chitting potatoes, the jury is out, because some say it's of a benefit and others don't. But for first early, second early and indeterminate potatoes, I believe that there is an advantage. By chitting these potatoes, it gives them a head start before you have to put them out into colder soils. Now, for Maincrop or determinate potatoes, there isn't the need to chit like there is for first, second and early crops. And the reason for that is they are planted much later and the soil is usually warmer by then. I always chit my potatoes because the potatoes are always available at the same time, and if you don't get them all when you can, sometimes you'll miss out on the varieties you want. By chitting the potatoes, it's a great way of preserving them because growing potato never dies. We're now ready to plant, and before we do though, we need to consider when to plant, and this is subjective depending on where you live in the world. Now, if you live where I do and the USA, a lot of the USA, planting due to the following times will be perfect. But if you live in Australia, then it could be the total opposite, but you just have to bear that in mind. So when to plant? Well, first earlies should be planted around the end of March. Second earlies and Indeterminate should be planted around about the middle of April, and late crop or determinates around the end of April. But there's always an exception to every rule, and you can push these time limits by growing indoors, and I'll cover more on that later. There are many ways in which to plant potatoes, and I'm going to cover quite a few of them in this video, but this is such a big area that I've decided to make a really much more detailed video on this, and that'll be coming up very shortly. So make sure you subscribe so you don't miss that video. But before we go into that, I just want to give you a little tip on Determinate or main crop potatoes. When you are chitting your potatoes, it will have produced a lot of strong chits on the potato. Now this is where the gardener can choose. They have a bit of control here. You can decide whether you want large potatoes or small potatoes. If you want lots of small potatoes, leave all of the chits on when you're planting them. But if you want large potatoes, pick 2 chits. That's all you need, and pull everything else off the potato so that you have a potato with just 2 really strong chits, or even 1 really strong chit on the potato, because that will allow you to control whether you have larger potatoes or smaller potatoes. So in this video I'm going to cover 4 ways in which to grow potatoes, and the first of those ways is the traditional trench method. The second is the Ruth Stout method. The third is in raised beds, and the fourth is in containers. Before I continue, I want to thank you all because we've just reached 90,000 subscribers, and I'm totally made up for that. So what I've decided to do, and I've left it till now purposely so that the people who are watching can benefit from this, I'm going to give away a $50 or £50 Amazon gift voucher for the person that is drawn out of the list of comments. Now, how you can play to win that voucher is from this video on until we hit 100,000 subscribers, you will get 1 point for every comment or every thumbs up or down, if you want to put a thumbs down, that you will put into the comment section of each of the videos from this point on. And the more points you get, the more entries into the draw you will have. And I will pick 1 person at random once we've reached 100,000, and it's just a little way to get a bit of fun so that we can all sort of join in the conversation in the comment section. So 1 point for every single comment or thumbs up or down, whatever you want to do, and you will get an entry into that draw to win a $50 or £50 Amazon gift voucher. So let's get back to the video. Traditional trenches, it's been used for hundreds of years, and it's one that the farmers use to commercially produce potatoes as well, because it's the cheapest way. To grow this way, you simply have to dig a shallow trench around about 8 to 12 inches deep. Add a small amount of manure and some blood, fish and bone or pelleted potato feed. Place your potatoes 12 to 15 inches apart within this row, and rows need to be around about 2 to 3 feet wide to allow you to hill up the potatoes later. Then all you need to do is simply backfill this row. Hilling first and second early potatoes is not really necessary. As we've already discussed, they grow on a single level. Now you only hill potatoes to block out the light. It doesn't increase the yield whatsoever. So with first and second early potatoes, it's not really necessary to hill because it has no benefit, as the potatoes don't get pushed up to the surface. They're growing on that single level. Main crop or determinate potatoes will need hilling, however, because as we've already mentioned, they grow on multiple levels on the stem and they will push through the surface if you don't hill up. So hilling those potatoes is really important, otherwise they're going to turn green in the sunlight and become poisonous and inedible. So as I've stated, we do not hill to get larger yields. We only hill to exclude the light. Now I've seen loads of people mounding huge amounts of soil on top of their potatoes, and anything more than 8 inches is just not even worth it because it has no benefit, and in fact it can even reduce the yield. The Ruth Stout method is very easy method to use. You plant these the same distances for hilled methods, only that you put the potatoes directly on top of the soil. There's no trench digging or anything, and then you cover those potatoes with around about 4 inches of straw. So with the Ruth Stout method, you have to keep applying straw periodically as the haulms grow, and eventually you'll end up with a bed of straw or mulch for around about 12 inches. This is great because it excludes all the light. However, using the Ruth Stout method can have a bit of a drawback in that the potato size is very small and also it can reduce yields. But the added bonus is it's very easy to harvest. Raised grow beds are fantastic for growing potatoes. They drain much better, and because they're deeper, then you can dig a hole around about 12 inches deep, drop a potato in and cover it over and you're done. Now it's much better in overhilled potatoes because these beds, they warm much quicker and they drain much easier, so the potatoes are not sat in water. Having loose soil will make harvesting much easier out of raised beds over traditional trench methods. Treat the potatoes exactly the same as you would for trench methods, and you're likely to get similar yields out of them, but with half the work. Now, if you've been around my channel for any length of time, you will know I'm an advocate for growing potatoes in containers or buckets, and these are much easier, and I find that I get usually double the yield for the space that I'm using. Now, growing the potatoes in containers is simple, and it's ideal for people who have mobility issues because you can simply just place the container down, fill it, plant your potatoes and grow it right there and then. Now, growing in containers is very easy. Simply add a few inches of either homemade or shop-bought compost into the bottom, add a handful of bloodfish and bone or pelleted potato fertilizer and mix this in well. Now just place 2 seed potatoes onto this compost and then fill the bucket at the halfway level, and this is where we add a little bit more feed. Now, if we was just growing main crop or determinate potatoes, we would stop here and just fill the bucket up with compost. If we were growing first early, second early or indeterminate potatoes, we can add a second row because we know that they grow on one level, so we can utilize this compost. So we can add 2 potatoes in like a cross formation. Once we've added those 2 potatoes, then we can fill the container right to the top with compost. There's no need to keep backfilling containers and letting the haulms grow and then fill some more like you would hilling for your traditional trenches. You can just completely fill the container in one go and it's done. Okay, and here's just a few reasons why growing in containers is so good. Number 1, they are much easier to plant. You know, you're not working really hard. You can literally just chuck some compost in, chuck the seed potatoes in, fill it and you're done. Number 2, they're easier to harvest because when you're harvesting, if you have issues or mobility issues, you can just literally turn them over and break the compost apart where they stand. It's very simple. There's no digging involved. Number 3, feeding is really easy because you've included most of it into the container. Number 4, you can get a start on growing your potatoes earlier. If you have a polytunnel or a greenhouse, you can start these much earlier than normal in the containers and then move the containers out after the last frost date. Now, number 5 is watering. These containers will hold water much better. They keep it around the root zone, whereas when you water like a traditional trench method or bed or Ruth Stout, that water is able to wick into surrounding soils, which is areas that the roots haven't reached yet. Not only that, the surface area is much larger in these other methods and it can evaporate much more readily. And the last, number 6 tip is that containers, these are dark and they absorb, because they're lifted out of the ground, they absorb the heat much better, so the soil warms quicker and therefore they get off to an earlier start and grow much better. Now, one drawback to growing in these containers is that some people have come to me and said, well, what a waste to use compost and spend out money to be able to fill these containers when it's free to grow in the soil. But by growing in those containers, I'm able to double my harvest. I get typically around about £15 worth of potatoes out of a single bucket. That's really good sense. And on top of that, I'm already buying compost to add to my soil, or I'm making it myself. And if you haven't seen my compost video, a link will be below, as will links for you guys to get hold of these containers if you want them. Now, I know thousands of you are growing in these containers since seeing my videos. They are fantastic. I purchased mine from Oakland Gardens in the UK, but I also have a link so that you can get similar products in the States below. So as I said, you know, for me, buying compost isn't a waste of money. I use it on my ground. So after growing in these containers, I can harvest the potatoes and I can either use that compost again and just add more feed next time, providing I haven't had blight, or I can just launch the compost onto the ground and increase the fertility and the structure of the soils in my garden beds. Now, potatoes love acidic soils, so anything on the pH scale from 5 to 7 would be ideal. It typically needs to be loose and free draining. And despite what you may have heard from a lot of old-time gardeners, they really hate the competition from weeds, so keeping weeds down is a must. Each time I move to a new garden, I'm told by a well-meaning gardener, oh, don't worry about digging the land or preparing the land, stick some potatoes in, they'll break it up for you. Well, it's not the potatoes doing that. You usually end up with a crappy harvest and you've got to dig the land to get the potatoes out. It's you that's turning that land over in the first place, not the potatoes. So do the work and then get a good yield afterwards. Now, before I continue, I just want to talk about my friend Hugh Richards. He's got out another brand new book. This is the second book that he's released, and this one is called Grow Food for Free. It's a fantastic book. It's really well laid out, and in it Hugh has all sorts of things about harvesting perennial crops, and I'm about 3/4 of the way through it and I have to say he's done a fantastic job. And Hugh's books, he's put a lot of work into them. There's huge amounts of knowledge in these books and I gotta say it's fantastic. If you want a copy of Hugh's book, I'll put a link in the comments section below for you. How much water do potatoes need? Well, as a rule of thumb, they require between 1 and 2 inches of water a week. That includes rainfall. They like to be moist but not sodden, and they don't like having their feet sat in water or to be too moist. So watering containers, well, I water every 3 or 4 days and I give a really good water until it's running out of the holes in the bottom of the container. And then I don't water again until I know that if I stick my finger into the soil right up to the knuckle and if it feels moist, I don't water. But if it's dry, I water again until the water comes out of the holes in the container. That way you get a moist container for a long period and it doesn't dry out on you. It's fantastic. Now, feeding potatoes, this is usually where a lot of folks really get this wrong. They find that when they come to the end of the season, they have a really poor yield on potatoes. But all year they thought they were going to have a fantastic yield because they've had really beautiful tops to the potatoes. And this is usually because they fed with something like chicken manure pellets. Now these are really high in nitrogen and they produce really huge amounts of top growth because of that fact. But we don't eat the tops of potatoes. Potatoes are a root vegetable, so why would we feed for the tops? Not only that, chicken manures and fresh manures, they're just way too rich and they burn the potatoes' roots and tubers. And this then lets in disease like scab. Because potatoes are roots, potassium and phosphorus are more important to its development. So we need to choose something with high potassium and phosphorus, something like a pelleted potato fertilizer with the appropriate amounts of say 5, 10, 10 or 8, 24, 24 would be better for tuber growth. Bone meal, blood meal and fish meal, or a mixture of all three called blood, fish and bone, can be added as a balanced fertilizer for long-term feeding over the growth of the season. Knowing when to harvest is some folks' real worry. You may have heard that it's time to harvest after the plants have flowered or when the foliage have died back. So let's take it from when the plants flowered. The flowering time is when a plant wants to go to seed, but it also corresponds with Maincrop and Determinate potatoes of when they start to form some growth in the tubers. Around this time you want to keep the intervals of watering regular because you never want that soil to dry out while the tubers are forming. Now, I've been asked many times about whether or not you should keep the flowers or remove the flowers on the potato plants. Now, the purpose of the flowers, or any flower for that matter, is for the plant to produce its own seed, to propagate itself if you like. Now, that takes up huge amounts of energy. And this energy is energy that's being used at the same time as trying to form tubers. So the plant's trying to do two huge jobs at the same time. It's my theory that removing the flower removes the stress on the plant of trying to do two jobs. If we remove the flowers, all that energy can be put into the tubers. Flowers are not necessary for the tubers, so you don't need to worry about keeping these flowers. After all, we don't want the plants to seed anyway. But on that note, if you did leave the flowers on, you would see some seed pods appear. They look a little bit like very small green tomatoes. Whatever happens, you should never eat these green pods. Neither should your animals, because they are poisonous to both humans and your pets. It's time to harvest when all the leaves are dying back. But don't dig them up just yet. Simply cut off all the haulms and take them away, and then leave the potatoes in the ground for a couple of days. Once it's left in the ground, this will give the skins chance to harden up a little bit. Then you can dig up the potatoes, and if we have a nice dry day, you can leave them on the surface and let them air a little bit. This will help to further harden those skins off, and then later we can move them inside of the house or in a polytunnel or greenhouse or shed or whatever you have. Place them on a wire rack to harden off a little bit more as well. Now, this is part of the curing process, and we need to cure these potatoes if we want to store them long term. Never wash any potatoes that you want to store. Instead, just brush off the dirt and allow them to dry off naturally. Storing potatoes, they need to be kept dry, cool, and usually around about 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees Celsius would be a perfect temperature in which to keep them. And you need to keep them in a cool, dark place, somewhere like a shed or a garage, even a crawl space under the house, something like that that's cool and dark. But you want to make sure it's free of any rodents or pests. When storing potatoes, select some that are the size of a large egg and store these separate from the others. These will become your seed potatoes for next year. By doing this, you sidestep the production chain or the supply chain, and this allows you to become more self-sufficient in a pandemic such as we're having now, should anything happen to our food and crops. On that note, I have a video that goes into complete detail on how to harvest, store, cure potatoes, so I'll put a link for that in the show notes below also. I hope this video has given you some fantastic tips on growing potatoes at home, and with the videos down in the show notes below, you should have all you need to get fantastic crops. If you got value from this video, you can subscribe here, and after you've done that, this is the next video you should watch, because this will show you exactly how to store the crops that you've just grown. I'm Tony O'Neill. This is Simplified Gardening, where I show you how to garden in a simpler way. Don't forget folks, you reap what you sow. I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.